Welcome, everyone, to the next iteration of the IITE seminars. It is, in fact, the first one of the year, and it is my great pleasure to welcome Shripad Tuljapurkar, alias Tulja, coming from Stanford University, who's going to be talking about pulses, presses, nonlinear responses, and I believe about the fact that pulse and press perturbations might not be as different from one another as one might think, but I will let Tulja divulge the rest of it. So without further ado, thank you. And Tulja, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for the invitation, and nice to be talking to you guys. Georgi, did I pronounce that right?
It's weird. It's Julie. You don't need to worry about
that. All right. So my topic here is on this slide, and the people who have contributed to this are actually the proverbial cast of thousands. So there's people from my group, Harman, Wenyan, and from Rob Salguero Gomez's group, including Maya and Sam, and other people have contributed in one way or another. These are the main culprits, as it were. So the basic idea that let's see, how do I, here we go. Thinking about is this idea, which seems to be quite popular in ecology nowadays, which is that you think about a system, population or group of populations or something, and then you have a perturbation. And for some reason, these perturbations in a lot of the literature have been classified into pulses, which are illustrated here. You have time on the horizontal axis, and you have something, a parameter or a population or whatever on the vertical axis. And then, you have a pulse perturbation. But you could also have a press perturbation. And so if you look, there are lots of papers about this. And here's one example, which discusses pulses, presses. And in fact, these people even talk about a third category, which is a ramp perturbation, but I'm not going to go there. We were thinking about the relationship between these, and I will tell you a bit about this relationship in different contexts, and I'll start with a fairly simple context. The story I'm going to tell you, we actually arrived at in a very different way, but we were trying to explain to each other what the hell it meant, and this is where we ended up. So the basic idea here is very simple. That is, a press perturbation is just a continued series of pulses. And this seems obvious when you look at the picture of the perturbation. So you can think about a regular series of equal-sized perturbations, and which go on forever, and that's a press. So how do we think about this in a particular context? And the way we were thinking about it initially was we were just thinking about a simple structured population model. This is a linear model. And the idea in the model is that you have a population vector at some time t. Time is discrete. And so you census the population, you get a vector n of t. And then the individuals in the different stages of the population make transitions to other stages, which might include reproduction. So they generate new individuals. And all of those are contained in a matrix. The matrix is non-negative because you either make a transition or not. And if you produce offspring, you have to produce more than 0. So that's the idea. And this set of transitions then leads you to a new population. So the whole business is, of course, described by this simple matrix vector recursion And it's well known that in biology, the typical thing is that you have a long run, you have a matrix B, and that matrix gives you these things. It gives you a stable stage distribution, a long run growth rate, and a stable reproductive value. And these are identified by looking at the dominant eigenvalue of the matrix, which is the equations on the right. So if you have a right eigenvector, that corresponds to the stable age distribution. The left eigenvector corresponds to the reproductive value. I call it the stable reproductive value because it can be used to weight populations of different compositions to give you a reproductive value. And then the last bit about this that is widely described is that a non-stable age distribution, U hat, converges to a stable age distribution, U, or the SSD, as time goes by. And this always happens. So now we are interested in thinking about this, and one way to think about it is to look at two parts of this matrix. You can think about the matrix as having a stable part, which is represented by this upper matrix Q naught, and an unstable part, which is whatever remains. And you are taking out the growth rate effect, so it's simply a stable part and an unstable part represented by matrices. And of course, the convenient thing about this is that these matrices provide a decomposition of the original population matrix divided by the dominant eigenvalue of the long run growth rate. So I want you to remember that this matrix Q naught is only dependent on the stable parts of the matrix, and the matrix Q1 is everything else. So how do we think about the dynamics here? Well, it turns out that any non-stable age distribution, which I'm representing here in this top equation by U hat, can be decomposed into two parts. One part is a constant K. K is just a number, and U is a vector. And that U is the stable stage distribution vector. And then you have another bit, which is the unstable bit, as I call it, and that's U perpendicular. So any population structure U hat can be decomposed into a stable part and an unstable part. And it turns out that this unstable part has a particular property, which is that it is perpendicular to the stable part. That's why I have a perpendicular sign on it. And U perpendicular, which is the unstable bit, is actually perpendicular to U. And it's perpendicular in a particular sense, which is that we tend to think of perpendicularity in Euclidean spaces, so you've got two things that are 90 degrees to one another. But in fact, in population dynamics, the space that we're thinking of mathematically is a non-Euclidean space, or another way of thinking about it is that the matrix that's involved is not a symmetric matrix. And so you've got right eigenvectors and left eigenvectors, and perpendicularity on one side of the matrix is defined with reference to the vectors on the other side. I could go on, but that's enough for the essential. And the important thing about making this decomposition is that when you take a non-stable age distribution U hat, the way you advance this non-stable age distribution is you keep acting on it with this matrix B. You take out the growth rate, and so the net result is the left-hand side of the equation in the box. And what that represents is you take the initial u hat and you step forward t time units, and the effect of that is given by b raised to t divided by lambda naught raised to t. We've just taken out the growth rate so that we can focus on the composition of the population. And it turns out that if you look at the effect of such an advance, the first thing on the right-hand side is simply the stable bit, which I've already identified. And the second part is q1 raised to t multiplied by the unstable bit, u perpendicular. And this second part is the part that eventually disappears. It's the transient part of the population dynamic. So this is I think, a convenient way of thinking about population structures, that they represent a deviation from a stable structure of a particular kind. That is a stable part and an unstable part that's perpendicular to it. And the unstable part simply decays over time, and the decay is described by the powers of Q1. And one way of thinking about it is to look at what happens when you have a pulse. So the way we think about it, you can think about a pulse disturbance in a lot of ways, but basically what I'm going to do is we're going to take a pulse which starts at the stable stage distribution. So you start with a population at the SSD, and then you put in a pulse at time 0, and the pulse ends at time 1. So during that time interval, the matrix of the population, instead of B, is B plus D, say. And after that time, you go back to the original matrix, and you stay there. That's a pulse. So how do we think about a pulse? You start with a not stable population at t equal to 1. And the reason it's not stable is you've started with the stable, and then you put this pulse in, and so that pulse shifts the population away from stability, and it gives you a population which is some combination of the stable distribution and a perpendicular bit. And then as time goes by, we already know that the stable part of this thing doesn't change, and the unstable part changes. There should be a 1 on this Q as a subscript. So it's Q1 raised to T acting on the perpendicular bit. And one way of thinking about it graphically is thus, instead of just calling the stable bit U in the picture, the stable vector of population composition is U naught. And what we're doing is we have a perpendicular component, U perpendicular, which we add to this as a result of a pulse. That perpendicular component gets smaller and smaller over time. So it shifts. Instead of the purple, it becomes the blue, and instead of the blue, it becomes the green, and so on as time goes by. So if you look on the left-hand panel, this process is shown graphically. In the middle panel, this process is shown as a sequence of algebraic steps. And in the right-hand panel, you see what happens, which is something that we're all familiar with. And this is just an example for a particular matrix and a particular type of pulse, where you see one of the stages in this matrix on the left-hand panel going back to its stable value over time. And on the right-hand, in the right-hand panel, the horizontal axis is one stage, the vertical axis is another, and you see some kind of dynamic taking place, which corresponds to the rotational thing that I showed you in the earlier plot. So much for pulses. And we can now think about presses. And for a press, you do the same thing as before. You start with a stable distribution, SSD, and then you have a pulse between 0 and 1. And you have another pulse between 1 and 2, and yet another between 2 and 3, and so on. And so the pulses continue forever. And what we're going to do is we're going to make the pulses small. And we can go to large pulses, but what I'm going to talk about here is trying to understand the effect of a small pulse. And that's why I've got an epsilon in there. The epsilon is simply a way of controlling the size of what you add on to the original matrix. If epsilon is 0, you have the original matrix. And if epsilon is large, then you have a large perturbation. So this is what we're doing, except we keep doing it forever. Now, we already know that the effect of such a change is that the long-run growth rate changes. So that part is well known. How about the dynamics? You start with the stable stage distribution at time 0. And then at time 1, between 0 and 1, you've applied a pulse. And so at time 1, you get a population, N1, say. But this population is, we can scale out the growth rate of the total population, which in this case is just mu. And the new population is the original SSD, which is U, plus a perpendicular bit, Z star. And this perpendicular bit is simply the contribution of the pulse between 0 and 1. And so you continue. I've shifted from capital N's to little n, so you'll forgive me. But if you go one more step in time, you get a second pulse, and you get the remains of the first pulse. And that's why on the right-hand side, you get the first term is the stable distribution, which you started with. The second term is the pulse between time 1 and time 2. The third term is the echo of the pulse effect, where the pulse was between 0 and 1. And the reason you get an echo, or the remnant of it, is that that original pulse has decayed in one time unit. And so you can continue. And at time t, you have a series of pulses. So the right-hand side contains the pulse that just happened, the pulse that happened one time unit ago, the pulse that happened 2 time units ago, and so on. And all those earlier pulses have actually decayed, or they've been acted on by this matrix Q1. And so you have this result where you have the effect of a pulse, the effect of the pulse 1 time unit ago, and so forth, and the effect of a pulse t minus 1 time units ago. And if you add all that up, you are adding a geometric series, and a geometric series is like 1 plus x squared, and so on, is 1 over 1 minus x. And in the same way, you can do the same sort of thing with matrices. And so the matrix expression of this is that you get a cumulative effect from Q1, and that cumulative effect is represented by I minus Q1 raised to the power minus 1. And then the whole contribution that you get is perpendicular to Q naught. So it's this simply represents the perpendicularity effect. And you find that the effect of a press is that you change from the original stable structure to a new stable structure. And the new stable structure is just this. And the second term on here is the new term that we're producing by having a series of pulses, and that's the term J naught times D times U. So we can represent this process graphically. And the way you can think about this is that you look at the left-hand panel, you have the original vector, which is U naught. And that original vector gets added to as a result of the first pulse. So you add on a bit given by the purple vector, which is Z star. And then at time 2, you get a new pulse and the remains of the old pulse. So you end up with something that's really different from the original stable distribution that you started with, and you continue in this fashion. And that's the description of this process algebraically is in the middle panel. You start with the stable structure, you add on a perpendicular bit, then you add on a perpendicular bit, and the decay of that, the last perpendicular bit, and you keep going. And the cumulative effect is, whoops, how do I go back? Okay, here we go. The cumulative effect is represented by that matrix J naught, which I had in this top equation here. And that's the effect that you see in this picture. The right-hand panel is what you would see if you did a numerical calculation. So the original component of a stable structure is shown by the dots. And then you have a series of pulses, which is a press, and that shifts the equilibrium to something that's shown by the dashed lines. And that's pretty much the story. Here is a, I think, distribution of what happens with a pulse. The reason I say I think is that these pictures were actually produced by my colleague Harman, and so I believe this picture is labeled inaccurately, but I'm not positive. I think the point here is if you look at the left-hand panel of this picture, you're looking at a stage distribution which originally, before the press, is the series of square dots, and after the press is a series of dashes. And so what you do is you get a series of perturbations which lead you to a final new equilibrium structure. And that's illustrated in the left-hand panel. So let me just go back to this equation. This is critical in a sense, because the idea here is simply that if you get a disturbance, the disturbance only matters to the extent that it shifts the equilibrium. And so if you look at the equation on this equation here, and you look at the terms on the right-hand side, the rightmost term simply tells you I'm shifting the equilibrium in a non-trivial way. That is, I have a perpendicular shift. The middle term is the actual dynamic effect of a pulse, which is a change forever. And that's pretty much what you end up with if you do a density-independent linear model. Now, we thought about this and the general concept, there's nothing about the conceptual structure that really restricts us to thinking about linear population models. So in fact, you can do this with density-dependent models, and it's fairly straightforward to do it with one equilibrium. And this equilibrium could be for one population with many stages, or many species with many stages, and so on and so forth. And you could think about such a population model as being a nonlinear model of the following sort, which is, again, in discrete time. You have some vector nft, which represents the state of whatever population or collection of populations you wish to describe. And then those make a series of transitions, which include perhaps interactions between species and so on. And they're represented by some matrix, A, which tells you what transitions in the individual components make. And theta here is just a set of parameters, which describes the interactions between populations, or the state of the environment, or whatever you like. And so this generates a new population vector, nt plus 1. I do everything in discrete time here. You don't have to. You can do it all with differential equations, and you get essentially the same kind of result with some changes in detail. An equilibrium of the system is some n star. And at that equilibrium, you have the matrix A, of course, is the equilibrium matrix, and n is the equilibrium population vector, which could be a collection of species, as I said. And so the equilibrium is n star equals a star times n star. So it's a nonlinear equation, and maybe you can solve it. And the typical thing that one does with population models that have one equilibrium is to look at the question of local stability. And the question of local stability simply says, I take the equilibrium n star, and I push the population a little bit away from the equilibrium. So I get the second last equation on this page, which is that I take the population n of t as being n star plus epsilon times y of t. Again, epsilon here is simply used to control the size of the second term. And so I'm making small deviations, which means I'm keeping epsilon small. And this allows me then in first order to write down a linear equation for the dynamics of the deviations. And the linear equation has this form. The particular form depends on whether you want to do it in discrete or continuous time. It really doesn't matter. You always end up with a form sort of like this, where the first bit is simply the equilibrium matrix, and the second bit is some contribution from the nonlinear dynamics. Now, local stability means that the matrix in square brackets, A star plus C hat, that is one matrix. And local stability means that the eigenvalues of this matrix are less than 1 in absolute value. This is discrete time. And the reason that corresponds to local stability is that if you take this matrix and you iterate it, or in terms of multiply it by itself several times, you are in effect multiplying the eigenvalues together, and those powers are going to shrink and eventually become 0. So that's local stability for you. So remember, the eigenvalues of the matrix in square brackets are less than 1 in absolute magnitude. And so now we're able to think about pulses. And the pulses I'm going to consider are, you change the parameters of the original problem from theta to theta plus epsilon phi. And then what that means is that you will end up with a new equilibrium population. And the new equilibrium is simply, say, n star plus epsilon x star. And you can ask yourself, what is x star? And lo and behold, the expression you get for x star is very similar to the expression that we previously had for J naught.
I'm so sorry. Is this a pulse or a press?
This is this is a press.
Yeah, thank you.
I find the terminology sort of confusing. It's a press, that is, it's a repeated series of pulses. If you go back to this equation here, the equation had 2 bits. It had a perpendicular component, which is represented by the rightmost term on the right-hand side. Then it had a geometric series, which is 1 minus q1 raised to minus 1, and it had a growth rate. In the density-dependent case, the growth rate is 1, so it disappears. But then you have this geometric series, and now the geometric series is given by this thing in square brackets, which represents, in effect, the local stability of the process. And C tilde, it turns out, represents the perpendicularity of the shift. So you get a very similar kind of effect. And there's lots of potential applications of this sort of thing. For example, one of the things that we've talked about a lot is using Lotka-Volterra type models. I don't happen to believe in them, but they've seemed to have found a great resurgence in the last decade or two. And in these models, you always have some parameters which represent interactions between species. And we actually don't know the precise value of those parameters. We estimate them, and we estimate them with some error. And the issue is, how much does that error matter to our predictions of the equilibrium population composition? And this allows you to figure that kind of thing out pretty easily. That's one application. I'm sure there are many more that I haven't thought about. The last couple of things that I'm gonna leave you with, one of them is in the previous models, we have described populations by a specific vector, which represents, different components of the population. But in truth, we probably have a situation where you have some probability distribution of those vectors, and then you have some equation like the top equation on this page, which represents the evolution of the probability distribution of a population vector, M or N, over time. And again, in discrete time, it's simply on the left-hand side, you have some probability distribution at time t. On the right-hand side, you have a transition probability from the previous population to the current population. This is a Chapman-Kolmogorov type of equation. And one way of writing in short form is the middle equation on this page, where everything is in the form of some operator acting on P of t minus 1. And generally speaking, you have an equilibrium. So P star is the equilibrium, and it has this property that it reproduces itself. But if you have an equilibrium and if it's stable, that means the equilibrium is locally stable. And that means that you can take the equation, you can think about deviations, small deviations from P star, and those deviations are going to decay. So you'll end up with a pulse-like, with an equation describing the effect of a pulse, very similar to the sorts of things we had before. So I think that this kind of approach is fairly general and can be used for lots of different examples. I've given you just a couple. So I'm actually going to stop here and then answer any questions.
Thank you so much, Tulja. So if you have any questions, as usual in the participant list, just raise your hand and I will call on you. So any questions? Okay, while people are thinking, I might have some questions. So one question, maybe the obvious one, and I might know the answer to that, but I'm not exactly sure, is that we were talking about the linear system for the first half of the talk, but the only equilibrium a linear system has is zero. So I'm not sure what was going on there, unless the reason why we divided by lambda zero all along was to normalize and essentially turn the matrix into a Markov matrix where the effective dominant eigenvalue is 1, so we converge to some non-zero distribution. Is that what's happening?
Yes. I mean, that's why you divide by lambda 0 or mu, as the case may be, so that you can sort of focus on the population structure. But this is a linear model, which is a linear model for the population, not for the deviations. So it's not a model where you converge to 0. It's a linear model which is fairly widely used in demographic applications. And so it has birth rates, death rates, growth rates, that kind of thing.
If we're at, thank you very much. And if we're at that one very quick technical question. So when you wrote that Green's function or analog thereof, sort of the J0, should there be an epsilon somewhere, or where did the epsilon?
Oh, sure. Yeah. I conveniently got rid of it. This is J0. This term is the leading order term, obviously.
Okay.
And you can do nonlinear terms after that if you wish.
Okay. Oh, thanks so much. Okay, so anyone? Oh yes, Axel, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you for the presentation. I hope you can hear me. You said, okay, the solutions of these problems, if you express them in terms of the response to a pressed perturbation, they all look similar. But what is there any conclusion that I can draw that then also what is the general conclusion that I draw from this formal similarity?
So there are actually several conclusions. One of them is that as long as you have perturbations which do not push you from the domain of attraction of one equilibrium to another, which we don't consider here, then within some domain of attraction, it really is not relevant to think about presses and pulses as being different sort of animals. You can get the effect of one from the other. That's number one. Number two, you can actually make the pulses unequal in size. And if you make the pulses unequal in size, then instead of J naught, what you get is a weighted series of perturbations where you have an actual time dependence built into the pulses. And that time dependence is, of course, different from the time dependence of the demography or the interactions between the populations. So what this enables you to do is to actually think about the interactions between perturbations that are being driven by whatever external factors might be that determine their time scale and the internal time scale of the dynamics of the population. It's that interaction that is captured by a weighted sum of this nature. And then there are I think the other applications depend very much on context. So for example, the reason I thought about the nonlinear model is let's say that you actually have some estimate of what the parameters in the model are, but there's some range of values, and you want to know how does that affect the equilibrium? I mean, do we have small effects? Do I care? And this kind of machinery enables you to compute those kinds of changes, in fairly straightforward way.
Okay, can I challenge you a bit on that? Okay, so because the conclusion disagrees with what I always felt was true, and I think getting to the bottom of it, if you have a system which is stable but not very stable, then a pulse perturbation will kick it out of equilibrium and eventually it will return. And so, okay, it's stable. But if you have a press perturbation, the response of the system can be so large that some of the abundances go to zero, extinguish species. And that I would say, okay, that's a big effect. And therefore, from this considerations, there are situations where the system can be linearly stable, but unstable to press perturbations.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is the whole point, that this kind of linear, or this order of analysis is only relevant as long as you stay within the same basin of attraction.
Mm.
If you have a very large, or not even very large, but a perturbation that drives some component to zero, or several components to zero, then you end up with a different assemblage altogether.
Mm.
And that in itself may be stable. And so you have, potentially a whole bunch of different domains of attraction. And it certainly, for some of the literature, this is what one is really focused on, is the movement. But for some of the literature, it is not.
Okay.
So that's
all right. Thank you. Then we agree on it. I'm really, thank you very much.
Thank you. Robin, please go ahead.
So if instead of having a press perturbation, you had different pulses, sizes at different times, I would normally think about analyzing that as using the answer you get would be the convolution with the transfer function. And so I think what J naught is it's the transfer function when you just have the same, your driving function is a constant. And I'm now thinking there should be a way then to take what you have here and think about the speed at which you get to that new point. And it's been an awfully long time since I've worked with discrete time transfer functions, but intuitively it feels like it should have something to do with the eigenvalues of that I minus Q1 inverse.
Yes, that is absolutely correct. So number one, it absolutely has to do with those eigenvalues. Number two, the eigenvalues of that transfer function really are, in the simplest case where you have equal sized pulses, are in fact just transforms of the eigenvalues of Q1 itself. So you can take a spectral decomposition of Q1 and then just simply do the sum component by component and get this thing. So you can, in the case where you have distinct eigenvalues, it's fairly straightforward. In the case where you have, repeated eigenvalues and all that kind of stuff, you have to use, as far as I can tell, something like this. The other point I did want to make is that, the way we got to this was we were thinking about two completely different problems. One is the problem where you have a linear population model, but you have stochastic effects on it. So you have a stochastic population model, and the stochasticity is autocorrelated. And many years ago, a postdoc of mine and I published a paper on this, and in that we looked at Markov chains as driving the stochastic shocks, and we got an expression which looks just like J naught here, except it has the autocorrelations of the Markov chain in it. And so that's really, the sort of thing you were talking about. And at that time, I just kind of moved on. But, this got us to thinking about that again. And I suddenly began to understand the connection. The third thing I would point out is that this actually turns out to be connected intimately with the second derivatives of the population growth rate. So it tells you something about the curvature of the lambda surface, which is weird, but I mean, I think it's weird, but that's what we found
Yeah,
out.
that part is not immediately,
Yeah.
that is novel to me.
Yeah, and you can actually do this kind of thing to higher orders. So that may be a, more general way of thinking about some of these questions.
Thank you so much. Are there any other questions? No, it seems there are no more questions. So then, I guess thank you again, Tulja, for coming and telling us about this. I had a lot of fun listening to this. I have recently been thinking about problems like this from a slightly different angle, but it was very nice. Also, you will not be embarrassed at all to learn that, of course, when I, back as a student, learned about structured population models, I used your lecture notes to learn about them. I assume I'm not alone in this audience.
Yeah, me too.
So anyway, thank you very much again, and we will see you in 2 weeks, and I believe it will be Chris Terry giving a talk at the time. So we will be in touch, and until then, have a good rest of your day, and see you next time around. Bye, everyone.
Bye.